Sometimes it's better for me to just sit back, bite my tongue, and then in 4 years I'll be able to say what I want.
There has been a gradual institutionalization of this code of conduct, the effect of which is to prevent people from ventilating their views. Bright students won't put up with it, and bright students ultimately drive out bad teaching.
Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith.
They stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber at Yale.
We disagree, we debate, and then at the end of the day, we remain friends.
Tickets are now on sale for our 14th annual conference on November 8th, featuring keynote speaker Vivek Ramaswamy. Join Buckley for a full day honoring the 50th anniversary of the Woodward Report, Yale's free speech principles, including speakers from the Yale administration, the original signers of the Woodward Report, and even a debate on the limits of free speech. Get your tickets or sponsor at buckleyinstitute.com/conference. Again, buckleyinstitute.com/conference. See you guys there. Thanks for joining us on Pod and Man at Yale. I'm your host, Ari Schaefer, Communications Director here at the Buckley Institute. Today, we'll be talking about campus protests and faculty political diversity with Claire Barragan-Bates, a senior.
Hi, I'm happy to be back.
And Owen Tilman, a sophomore.
Good to be back. Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming on the show. Last semester, Yale, like so many other campuses around the country, had part of its campus taken over by the anti-Israel, pro-Palestine protests. Many students I've talked to anticipate them coming back. We've seen a little bit of discussion, a couple ads for protests on campus, but nothing substantial so far. But looking back on those protests, reflecting on what happened last semester, those protests, do you consider them disruptive, or was that just kind of part of the college experience?
I think that protest culture is part of the college experience. I mean, I remember my mom telling me stories about going to college in Northern California in the 90s and what protest culture was like up there in a very sort of blue area, very socially progressive. And I think that that's kind of what's going on here too. But it is disruptive, and it's crossed the line from just being a normal college experience sort of protest to being disruptive at the point that these protesters broke the law.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree. I mean, I also think that, I'm ethnically Jewish, not religiously Jewish. We've been through a lot worse than just a few bad protests here and there. And it definitely, I think, became sort of part of the college experience to be in the presence of these kinds of protests, to be in the presence of, I think, incredibly disruptive, social justice movements on campus. But I think, beyond that, as long as you're able to sort of realize, really what's going on here, which is just people jumping on the bandwagon of the new hot social justice thing, something that will likely die out in a few days, if not a few months, which is exactly what it did, from what I understand, then I think you're able to make your peace with it. And that's what I've done.
So there already has been a bit of a protest this semester. It wasn't really on campus per se, but it was outside the courthouse. I think it's the New Haven County Courthouse, where 14 out of the 44 Yale students or Yale connected protesters who had been arrested as part of protests had pretrial hearings. I think criminal trespass is what they were all charged with. So do you think arresting them and clearing out the protests, was it a good decision at the time?
Yes, absolutely. Those individuals were being very disruptive, not only to the operations of campus, but to the operations of the city of New Haven. It posed a danger to the public by obstructing traffic when they were gathering illegally. They were trespassing on private property. Remember, Yale University is a private property. I think that Yale University had every right to do that, and I'm glad that they did, because at the end of the day, these people broke the law, and they were given multiple warnings upon warnings upon warnings, and they were extended the olive branch by Yale's administration so many times, and they continued to be antagonistic.
Yeah, I think that I've mixed feelings on the subject. On the one hand, I think that, yeah, obviously it's true that if you break the law, that should be met with due enforcement, right, on the part of people who are supposed to be enforcing laws. The way that I think we're going to start really convincing people is not by censoring them. And I do think that, there is this kind of directive on the part of maybe the more neoconservative wing of the Republican Party to prioritize censorship, right, to sort of issue threats to kids, right, and to not really address substantively why what they're saying is wrong, and instead just sort of jump to these very draconian measures. And I think that that's not really my preferred means of dealing with this. I'm friends with a lot of people with whom I completely disagree on the issue, and they're for the most part not evil people. I think that there are definitely evil people on this campus, and I think that there are definitely evil people outside of this campus who support the pro-Hamas cause. But at the same time, right, I think that people really are going to do some far more effective and persuasive work on the part of the Israeli people by engaging in conversation and by engaging in a forum rather than censoring them. So I have dual thoughts on the matter.
So kind of to that point, and sorry to put you on the spot here, Owen, I just want to kind of contrast with something Claire had said, because she had emphasized that at the end of the day, Yale is private property and it was disruptive. That it being private property, the First Amendment isn't. Especially with regards to free speech, isn't the entire law of the land, and even in public places you can have time, manner, place restrictions on that. So I mean, I hear your point about the you're wanting to convince rather than censor, but how do you draw that line in your own mind?
Well, so to be clear, I mean, I think that the line of legality cannot be crossed, and I think that that's something where this isn't really a rebuttal to what Claire was saying. Any more than it is a yes and, because I think that, obviously if you break the law, there's absolutely no justification for it. And there's also no material gain for your movement. I mean, that's one of these ridiculous, sort of false premises of the anti-Israel movement that, somehow by setting up encampments and disrupting traffic and gluing your hands to the street, that you're somehow going to convince people that your cause is worthwhile. Obviously, no, that's not true. And independent of that, laws need to be followed. Our police need to be respected, and our laws need to be respected. But beyond that, I think that right now, right, what you need to be telling to people in this movement, right, is not you're a bunch of ignorant, stupid Neanderthals who don't understand anything. And while I do think that ignorance is probably very much so the culprit, but my way of going about it is different than I think perhaps the mainstream pro-Israel position, which is I'd like to have a conversation with these people and trying to convince them. And I think that that's what we should do if we really want to win the war. And
I'll just kind of add to that before I go on to kind of like the next question, unless Claire has something else to add. But I've always kind of agreed with that perspective personally. Like I think the idea or the argument that, the students don't know what they're talking about, or like they don't know the information, I feel like is like almost like a coping mechanism. Mm-hmm. And you see it in like other political issues also. While the other side, they just don't know the issues. And I think people like to tell themselves that because it's easier than accepting the fact that maybe people just see the world a different way or see the issues a different way.
For sure. And I also think, and just to loop in, a recent, news development here at Yale, McInnes's establishment of a committee to perhaps adopt neutrality on political issues. I don't really know. I think that the pro-Israel community, at least here at Yale, from what I've understood, is kind of split on that decision. On the one hand, people are like, oh, no, Yale should not be neutral on this issue. It's that important. It's that severe. It's in our everyday lives. And then on the other hand, you got people who are like, no, this is actually a victory, because it's like if these institutions aren't compelled to take, socially palatable stances on incredibly hot topics and just be the educational institutions that they're supposed to be, I consider that a victory.
Well, I absolutely second that. I think that universities are designed to be places of intellectual rigor and discourse, where we examine ideas critically and analytically, where things are not off limits to think about, things are not off limits to say, in theory. Yet, I think that the erosion of our free speech rights on campus will be the demise of the university. So I think that institutional neutrality is a huge step in the right direction towards a Yale in which we're able to actually engage in political discourse across the aisle again in ways that are more meaningful than what's happening right now.
Mm-hmm. So, I don't want to get too distracted in institutional neutrality. We can cover that on another episode. So I do want to just kind of quickly wrap up this section. Even if you think it was right for Yale police to clear out the protest on campus, do you think that the charges should be put forward? Yale says they don't have control over that, but assuming they did, or like in theory, do you think the charges should be dropped, or do you think the students should have to face the consequences?
Well, I have two thoughts on that. First is that the optics are unfortunate of the charges being pressed against these students. Obviously, it looks bad. Obviously, when it's talked about in major national news, it's going to make Yale as an institution appear a certain way to the public. But at the same time, the fact is that these students broke the law, period, end of story. After many, many, many negotiations, extensions of the olive branch from Yale administration. So no, I don't think that the charges should be dropped.
The whole point of civil disobedience is that you will be punished for it, right? It's not civil disobedience, right? If the point is to, get arrested, right? And then sort of stamp out why the charges should be dropped in court. That's not what civil disobedience really is. You go in with the understanding that you are going to suffer consequences, and that is your sacrifice, quote unquote. It's you signaling materially your solidarity with the cause you support. So it's like, dude, if seriously, if you are seriously, if you're serious about this whole Palestine thing, then yeah, you should face charges if you break the law.
First of all, I had a little bit of a funny thought that these individuals at Yale, they strike me as very comical. They strike me as very farcical, maybe would be the word, because they think that they're like the Gandhis for Gaza. Yet these are the kids that have no financial aid. They're setting up like homeless encampments on Beinecke Plaza.
So I just want to move on to the next topic, and this discussion has been great, but I want to cover something that the Buckley Institute is working on, something we did last year. We're about to put out the newest version of our faculty political diversity report. We looked at, last year, we looked at 4 departments in the law school. This year, we looked at 27 departments in the law school within Yale. And we looked at the voter registration, political donations to find out what the bias actually is within the faculty. If anyone's going to read it and be surprised, it'll probably be how lopsided things are. We found about 1,000 faculty, a little over 1,000 faculty. 77% were Democrats. Under 3% were Republicans. Just for reference, Gallup does a monthly poll of America's political leanings, political affiliations, and Democrats and Republicans have been roughly even for years. Does that just imbalance surprise either of you?
Not at all surprising. I think that the biggest problem, and this is I guess where my mind immediately goes to is one of the first experiences that I had on Yale's campus, and that was in a Camp Yale program, and we had like a guest speaker come in, and it was I think at the 53 Wall Street lecture hall, and they just start making they start making incredibly general political statements along the lines of all Republicans are racists, all Republicans are sexists. Wow. And there was this weird sort of ambient pressure to validate it with applause, which is what everybody did. And it's like, why, how can that possibly exist? And it's like that is the most evil thing, right? That's the most evil component of being in such a politically homogenous environment, because it's like, it's sort of assumed that you agree, right? Mm-hmm. That with all of these incredibly contestable claims about the nature of the other side, and it's just taken to be true, right? And it's kind of, you basically have to go out of your way, right, to differentiate yourself, which is what I think conservatives on Yale's campus have to do. So
as bad as the overall data was, and we did 14 departments categorized by Yale as humanities and social sciences, and they're 87.7% were registered Dems, only 1.1%, and I put the 0.1 in there to help him out a little bit, were registered Republicans. So that's across 356 faculty. There were 4 Republicans. Of the 14 departments that we looked at in humanities and social sciences, 10 had 0 Republicans. The other 4 had 1. Does this kind of stuff surprise you?
It does not. And I think that, one of the talking points that I think I've heard a lot is, well, originally, going back 30, 40 years, right? Even probably further back than that, why didn't conservatives seize the mantle? Why isn't there such a strong conservative presence on campus? Isn't that the fault of conservatives for not, stepping into circles in which they might be unwelcome? It's like, no, I think that conservatives are actively discouraged from being in these circles, and they're not hired at the same rates as liberals. It's just that simple. And these results are staggering. I mean, 87% Democrat across 14 departments, 4 people identifying as Republicans, and then 10 with not a single Republican. I mean, that's insane. This is Yale University, right? And the fact that, critical thinking is treated as the highest value, despite these statistics, I think it's truly expository of what the institution really is, and that is incredibly homogenous. And it actually does not conduce to critical thought.
The Yale Daily News did a survey of the freshman class. They got 541 respondents. So of those, only 8.5% identified as conservative, 67% identified as left-leaning. There were more than 3 times as many very left-leaning students, around 29%, as conservatives overall. So does that match your experience? We'll start with Claire on this one, and does that surprise you at all?
It's not at all surprising. I think that outside of these conservative circles, there's a very strong sort of social pressure to be liberal on campus and to hold specific political beliefs. And there's definitely a sort of in-crowd factor that goes along with it.
Well, I mean, I think that if it's a cultural problem, right, that conservatives are not welcome on these campuses, I don't think that precludes, the possibility that there is actually, that principle, right, or that sort of cultural directive is not codified in actual university policy, including for hiring professors. The question, I guess, at hand is, okay, well, does that mean that simultaneously there's a preference for those kinds of people in the application process? Yeah, I will absolutely maintain that that's true. And I think that the reason why I'm so comfortable making that claim is just the fact that these results are so staggering. The fact that you can only name drop 4 Republicans, maybe, right, out of 356 people, right, across a bunch of different departments, and then you can have 10 out of these 14 departments with no Republicans, I think is pretty damning. And I don't just think it's due to the fact that that academia attracts maybe more liberal people. I do think that it has to do with the fact that the people who would, for instance, resist a DEI training or a racial sensitivity training or a gender sensitivity training or things like that are sort of a perk of being in a tenured professor position or even just like an assistant professor position, means that you will be refused from a seat at the table in academia. And I think that's perfectly consistent with the data. So
I just want to kind of, I guess, bring this back to like the broader, a little bit of your experience, a little bit of your thoughts on how on the campus, how do these numbers, the heavy bias towards people of progressive perspective, people on the left, Democrats, both within the faculty and among the student body, how does that impact the campus? How does that, how is that reflected on your experience?
It's everywhere. It's just taken sort of for granted that everyone is a leftist. There are passing comments everywhere. For example, I had a class last night, a class that I actually really enjoy with professors that I really respect and admire. But one of the professors made a passing comment about how he hates Trump and just kind of like laughed it off, sort of assuming that everyone in this class is a progressive when that in fact is not the case. Obviously, I'm in this class. I wasn't offended by that, but I just noticed that there are things like that happen all the time.
But the problem is this, right? When you're in an environment that, as Claire said, sort of takes a lot of ultra liberal beliefs, and by ultra liberal I mean really, really liberal beliefs, as just sort of true, right? By omission, right? Unqualified goods, right? And everybody just sort of tosses them around, right? It's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy where like you think everybody believes it, right? And then you're like, okay, maybe I should believe it. And then you kind of like gaslight yourself into believing it, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the mental gymnastics that I think totalitarianism frankly requires of you, right? And it's 100%, it's 100% willed on your part, and you have control over whether or not to do it. But it's exactly what happens when you're in an environment that just treats all of these things as true.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on Pod and Man Yale. Owen, Claire, appreciate you guys coming on.
Thank you. It was lovely to be here.
Shoot us a message sharing your thoughts about Yale's faculty political diversity problem at info@buckleyinstitute.com. Do you guys think it's a problem? Look forward to reading what you have to say. And now, we'll move to my interview with Yale professor Steve Smith to get a professor's perspective on the protests on campus last spring. I'd like to welcome Professor Stephen B. Smith to Pod and Man at Yale. Professor Smith is the Alfred Cowles Professor of Political Science and Professor of Philosophy, and has taught at Yale since 1984. He's a widely published author of many articles and books, including his most recent book, Reclaiming Patriotism in an Age of Extremes. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to be here with you, Ari.
So first, I just want to dive into what it was like to watch the protests that erupted on Yale's campus in the spring from the professor's perspective. We've talked to students about this a few times, but what did you think watching all that unfold?
College students protest. I get it.
Sure.
I protested. I mean,
it's a time-honored college experience.
Time-honored experience. It happens every year for some reason or other. So the principle is not a problem with me, but of course, not only here, but many other places, it got very ugly too. And I think it was different in many ways from previous protests. Many of these had a personal side, a personal direction to it, targeting not only a policy that students objected to, or a war that they might have objected to, but to students, it seemed to be opposed to the very, in some cases, not everybody, of course, the presence of Jews and Jewish students here.
So a lot of the focus, as I mentioned, has been on the students and how it's affected them. And obviously that's understandable. These are their suite mates, their dorm mates who they're protesting. But it wasn't just students who are part of these protests. There were faculty who participated in the protests, or faculty who participated here at Yale. I think there were some faculty or grad students who were even arrested as part of the protests. Does that change your perspective on some of your faculty, your colleagues?
It has to. I would say the people who were most involved in it, and I don't know them. I mean, I don't know them. There was no one in my department that was, to my knowledge, who had any involvement in this. It will not be a surprise. They come from certain departments that generate these kind of attitudes. I will say one thing, however. I said this recently, or not that recently, I guess. It was at a meeting of, at the shop tie. And there was a discussion of the protests and the doxing truck that went around. Right. I think they doxed the wrong people. I think they should have doxed the faculty members who were saying and doing things that were very pro-Hamas, because I think they're in many ways the instigators.
So on that point, I want to talk about one faculty member in particular, Zarina Gruel. She was made a bit of news in the beginning as October 7th was still unfolding. Right. She was calling Israel a murderous, genocidal settler state. She called October 7th an extraordinary day, quote, unquote. And she said that any settler, as she understands it, is a target, right? They don't count as civilians. That means pretty much anyone in Israel, she sees it. And a lot of people in that mindset think that about Americans as well. So what do you think of those comments first? And how do you feel about working on the faculty with someone who believes that if you're hanging out in Israel, you deserve to be attacked by Hamas?
This was when the news of her comments, when I was following them online, I should say I'd never heard of her before. I didn't know who she was. It is a shocking thing to think there are people on the faculty, anti-Semites, like real anti-Semites. Somehow you never quite think these are the people around you.
Right.
and who are employed at a serious place like this. And it does make you wonder what happened to make this possible.
Do you wonder, knowing that, there's Zarina Gruel out there being public and comfortable about her perspective, that maybe there are a lot more faculty, or just a handful of faculty that you interact with, who might hold those perspectives?
Well, yeah, that's one of the problems. I mean, we don't talk about this, or at least people I know. I suspect it is deeper than I like to think. It creates an atmosphere of suspicion and doubt about which had not previously existed, and that's very troubling.
How do you think a faculty members kind of get that way, where they get this perspective that October 7th is right and it is just? Is it, you mentioned it's an anti-Semitic perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Is it they are anti-Semites and then get tenure, or do you think, is there some kind of push and pull within the world of academia? That's
a great question. Of course, it's one I've thought a lot about. And my guess is that we're talking about a generation who has been brought up on this language of settler colonialism, mm-hmm. who have been taught to believe that empires are the worst things that could colonialism. This is the worst thing that human experience has ever created. And that then they go out to find, they go out to divide the world then between oppressors and victims. It's a very simple binary. Once you accept this, it's a very simple binary world. The world is divided between oppressors and victims. And this often is mapped onto a racial component too. Settlers are white, colonialists are white, victims are always people of color. And of course, the ridiculous thing about this is, in a place like Israel and Palestine, there is, the idea that Jews are the whites, when, of course, in living memory, that the Jews were exterminated in Europe because they weren't white, because they were seen as being not white, not right. Aryan. And, so it begins with this racialized idea of settler colonialism. And then, of course, they look for examples of it. And it is very easy then always to make Israel becomes always exhibit A when it comes to this. We live in a country, on this regime, the American regime is a white settler colonial, as it were. Many countries throughout the world are. How are countries established? Through migrations, through conquests. It's not pretty, but this is the world, this is history, this is the world. And yet somehow Israel is always taken to be the exhibit A of the white settler colonialist experience. How does that get to the students? How do students end up inculcating that kind of perspective? I had many conversations last year with students about this, and nearly all of them agree that they get this. They're radicalized online. That was confirmed to me on several occasions by students. And, it's a Yale students you think are taught to be critical thinkers, to be skeptical, and yet many of them at least completely seem to have bought into these narratives that come from the most dubious sources online. So I want to pull back to your experience and the things you've done yourself on campus, and you got a little bit of publicity in last spring. There are a number of campuses that canceled their graduation ceremonies because they were afraid of pro-Palestine protests. Yale had theirs. There was a walkout. Some students did walk out in protest of Yale's unwillingness to divest from Israel-connected companies, I think. And while they were walking out, you were standing there. You had an Israeli flag, and you pulled it out, and you kind of waved it in their faces, kind of a show of strength and security and confidence in Israel. Why was that something you wanted to do personally? I march every year in graduation. It's very important. I've done it for years and years. And inevitably there are well, I knew there was going to be a protest. I know. And I didn't, as the poet said, I didn't want to go gently into that good night. I wanted to make a statement, So I brought an Israeli flag, suspecting I had it under my robe, folded up. I wasn't going to do this just without provocation. I wasn't going to be I didn't want to be the provocateur. Exactly. So when this happened, I took out the flag and waved it in front of the protesters who were shouting pro-Palestinian slogans. That frankly, they didn't seem to pay much attention to me. And I don't know if they noticed. They were in their own world. And much to my surprise, I mean, because this didn't go on very long, maybe I shouldn't be surprised, somebody somewhere, filmed it and put it online. And before the day was out, my inbox was just being inundated. It went on for about several days, inundated with letters. And I should say, 99% of them were all positive, all supportive. I wish more would push. It was just symbolic, but it was a pushback against. It's just to say, there are people who disagree. There are people who disagree with you. Let them know.
Why do you think it was important for you as a faculty member in particular to kind of take that stand?
I didn't like I think, there's a lot of moral intimidation that goes on with this. And having spoken to a number of Jewish students over the spring, I felt that they were intimidated and didn't really know, either felt uncomfortable or didn't know how to respond to this. But I thought it was, to me, important to say there's somebody on the faculty, at least, who is willing to push back against this aggressive protest movement.
What was the response from other Yale faculty? Did anyone say anything to you?
Zero.
Really?
Yeah, no.
How about students? Did you hear from any students?
From many students. They were all thankful.
And I feel especially for the students, and I said this to a lot of people in the weeks after October 7th, I come on campus, we do what we can, and then I go home, right? For a student, you see your friend supporting Palestine or even supporting Hamas on Beinecke, they might be your next door neighbor.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how do you, I feel for them.
Exactly.
How do they respond considering that's what they're dealing with? Do you think, these kind of, campus takeovers about Israel, are they something we should expect more of?
I suspect we're not going to see a repeat of last spring. I think many people, they went too far. I think the administrations of many universities believe it's gone too far and they're not going to tolerate this kind of takeover that we saw. I want to say one thing, which is this. I actually think Yale did pretty well, all things considered, last year, particularly in comparison to many other campuses where we saw violence. I know maybe it's unpopular to say something positive about Yale, but I do want to say I think we, as an institution, handled things pretty well.
And no, I'll say this is something we noticed early on. I mean, then President Salve's statement was better than most of his. Probably the best I saw in the Ivy League. He seemed to be stronger on the side of Jewish students and more, I guess, convicted that Israel just wasn't to blame for everything, and I think that was encouraging. And kind of building off of that, what do you think Yale did right that made that possible? And what do you think Maury McInnes, the new president, can do to make sure when Yale does have protests, they're civil, they don't become a Columbia, become a UCLA?
Well, I think partly it's we have a different kind of student body here than some of these other institutions do, which makes a difference. President McInnes the statement that's come from her office was strong and useful, and I'm hoping she will be someone who is a leader in opposing the kinds of anti-Semitism that has sometimes in other campuses has been allowed to foster. Anti-Semitism is in many ways the oldest and mostly in many ways deep-rooted form of racism. It hasn't disappeared. And listen, I'm a teacher. I hope we can learn something from this, and people will begin to understand more what's at stake in these reasons. We are in a struggle for the soul of the university. I really do believe that.
All right. Well, with that, I just want to thank you for coming on Pod at Man at Yale. It was great having you.
It's my pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Thanks again for joining us for another great episode of Pod and Man at Yale. Send us your thoughts at info@buckleyinstitute.com. I look forward to reading what you've got to say.